I wanted to share a story of my father, but because of the severity of it, and out of respect for my mother, I will be keeping locations vague and the names made up to prevent people from trying to find us. My family was the most ordinary that you could find. It was my mom, who worked as a substitute teacher, my dad, who was an accountant at a local firm, myself, and then my twin brother and sister. We lived in a small 3-bedroom house with a connected garage. My mom drove a minivan and my dad had a pretty old beat-up car. My mom worked at home sometimes when she graded papers, but otherwise she was home to take care of my siblings until they were old enough to stay with my grandparents while she worked. My dad was up at the same time as me most mornings. He would be getting his shoes on or finishing his coffee while I was having my breakfast, so I would see him off. My mom wore nice skirts or slacks when she worked. My dad always wore the same dark pants and jacket. They rarely diverted from the normal routine, my dad even more so. My mom could be more fluid depending on the day, but not my dad. His idea of changing things up would be not wearing a tie on Fridays. He was that kind of guy. I loved him regardless, and to me, they both just seemed like your normal parents. But the most unusual thing about him was his home office. He set it up in our garage. Like many parents' home offices, I'm sure, we were told that it was strictly off limits to everyone. Even my mom seemed to respect this boundary. When I asked about it, he told me that it was just due to private customer information that I wasn't allowed to see. As a kid, that made enough sense to me, so I avoided it. I had no reason to go into the garage anyways. My dad used to work in the garage at random times during the week, but he began working in there more and more during the weekend, too. Again, I was young enough that I just assumed he had a lot of work to do. My curiosity peaked when, one day, I was trying to find some tape. I asked my mom, who told me to ask my dad, and he said that he may have some in the garage. He was in the middle of something, and that comment to me sounded like permission to go get it. So, I went into the garage, and that was the first time that I saw his office. It was a one-car garage, so it wasn't huge, but I was surprised to see everything in it. I don't even know when he did it, because I couldn't remember seeing him bring anything in other than a desk. But he had his computer set up out there. There were 2 filing cabinets, 2 chests with locks on them, and his old workbench pushed along the opposite wall. I knew that he had all kinds of stuff in his tall toolbox, so after staring at the desk, I went over to the toolbox to sift through it. It wasn't long after that I heard my dad's booming voice. "What are you doing in here?" It made me jump as he used his stern voice. I told him that I was trying to find the tape. I could tell that he wasn't happy with me, as he reminded me that I was told to never go in the garage. I tried to say that I didn't mess with his desk, but he wouldn't hear me out. He yelled at me that I was not allowed in there, and I remember just being scared. I left quickly and locked myself up in my room, wondering what I had done wrong. He later came up to my room and apologized, but said that no matter what, I was never to go into the garage, and if I ever needed anything, I had to ask him to go get it, or to knock on the door if he was in there. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal, but I agreed that I would not try to go back in there. But it's kind of one of those unspoken rules, especially as a kid. Whenever you're told to not go somewhere, not to look, whatever it is, you want to. You want to do that very thing even more. So, one weekend, my parents were invited to a party by one of my mom's friends. They didn't have kids, so to me it would have been really boring. My siblings, however, were still rather young, and they could be kept occupied by a single toy, or each other, for several hours. Thankfully, at the age of 14, my parents trusted me to be home by myself for a few hours. My grandparents also lived on the next street over, so if I needed anything, I could just call them. My point being, this was my opportunity to, once again, go through the garage without being interrupted by my parents. They took my mom's van, so my dad left his keys hanging by the door. He had installed a deadbolt on the door to the garage, and he was the only one with the key. After they were gone for a good half hour, I finally grabbed the key and went to the garage, ready to find out what the big deal was. I was expecting to find just a bunch of paperwork that I didn't understand, and a computer with no games on it. At first glance, that's exactly what I was seeing. His desk was neat and organized. A small plastic shelf with folders on it sat on the desk. The computer was password protected, and after 2 attempts, I gave up, not wanting to alert my dad. There were shelves attached to the desk, and after trying a few of his keys, I found the correct one. Opening the drawer, I found more of the same. Some folders and notebooks, nothing far out there. But as I rifled around the drawer, I realized the back of it was soft. But looking at the back of the desk, it was hard metal. It was like the drawer had a false back. And after some finagling, I was able to pull it down. Now, this is where I got confused. I remind you, I was 14 and it was the early 2000s, and I was naive. I had a pretty normal family, and the worst thing I'd ever experienced or knew about in our immediate circle was when someone in the neighborhood ran over a kid's bike. There were no kids nearby, nor were they harmed. So when I found a small Ziploc bag with a soft substance in it, I didn't know what to think. There was also a small notepad that had various names and numbers next to it. I put everything back as it was, including the false wall as much as possible. I opened the drawer above that had what I could only describe as a photo album. But it was filled with pictures of weapons, all being held by my dad, with our garage door in the background. I recognized it because the bottom panel on the garage door was a different color from the rest. I was confused. My dad never seemed like the type that was interested in collecting guns, so what was the point in a whole album like that? And on top of that, where were these weapons? Because, as far as I knew, he never showed us any, nor was I aware of there being anything like that in our home. Were they somewhere in the garage too? The only place I could possibly think was in the large old chest that was against the wall. I tried every key on his ring and none of them worked. I was never able to confirm what was in that chest. I was starting to feel uncomfortable in the garage as something was telling me that this was not right. That something about this whole thing was wrong, and maybe that's why my dad didn't want me in there. I made sure everything was back the way it should be, locked it all back up, and went to my room to try to distract myself. I know that I wasn't supposed to be in there, but something told me that what I saw was wrong. But I didn't know what, if anything, I could do about it. I didn't even know if my mom knew. When my parents came home, I couldn't look at my dad the same way. They both seemed normal, the same way as they left, but I couldn't shake those images of my dad holding all those guns. And unfortunately, that's how I saw them from then on. I had good days with my dad after that, but they were then clouded by those images. It was a few weeks that I lived with these thoughts, but it only got worse when I saw some strange men coming over late at night. The window in my room faced the driveway, so I saw my dad standing there with the few men. They would talk for a while, shake hands, and then leave. I had never seen them before, and they were never nicely dressed like my dad was. In the end, I did nothing. I lived with what I knew and just watched my parents closely, noticing how my mom was never involved or seen with my dad when he did anything that involved the garage. That was until one late night on a Thursday. I had been asleep, but was awoken to a loud thud. I thought nothing of it at first, until I heard my parents arguing. I couldn't quite make out what was being said, but I could tell that my mom was clearly upset. I heard the garage door open and watched my dad walk out, toss a suitcase in his car, and burn out. I went back to sleep after that. The next day, when I came home from school, I spotted my dad and two guys loading a lot of his chests and desk into the back of a truck, my mom standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Once again, I had no idea who the men were. My dad gave me a hug and said that he had to leave for a while and told me how he was proud of me, and then he left. I asked my mom what he was doing, and she told me that my dad had made some bad choices, so we had to leave in order to think about it. That was the first time I mentioned the office to her. I asked if it had something to do with his work. She looked at me suspiciously, like when a parent thinks you're lying, and after a short stare down, she said yes, and then nothing else. Little did I know that that was the last time I would see my dad. He called me on my birthday that year, but then called one other time, where he argued with my mom, and that was it. 2 years later, he was in a car accident that killed him. There were a lot of cops at our place, and they asked a lot of questions. After they were gone, that's when I finally asked my mom some of my own questions. I asked her if his accident had anything to do with his work, and she said yes. I then specified if it had anything to do with the chests and drugs, and she looked at me surprised. And then she asked me how I knew. I confessed to her what I saw that night, and she gave me a little more information, but not much, as I was still barely 17 at the time. As you could probably guess, at some point, my dad started delving into a bit more than just accounting. At first, my mom had no idea and no suspicion, even though she didn't agree with how angry he got with me for being in there, but she just let it go. But when the strangers showed up at our place, my mom was no longer feeling safe. She did something similar to what I did while he was taking a shower, and found the same thing. That night, they got into a huge fight, and my mom demanded that he get out of it, and he refused. So, she kicked him out, threatening to tell the police if he didn't. That night, he chose that lifestyle over us, over his family. The police found incriminating things in his car and his apartment, which made them knock on our doors, and my mom told them that she had no idea what he was doing, but that they had split up because he had been acting weird. Nothing was in our home, and she was never charged with anything. I know that my mom did what she did to protect us, but part of me wonders what would have happened if I had spoken up sooner. What would have happened if I had told either of my parents what I found? What about the police? Could it have kept my dad from dying? His accident was suspicious, but nothing was ever determined beyond him crashing his car into a tree. My mom, siblings, and family are okay now, but it's something that's kind of become a bit of a family secret. Only certain people know the whole story. My siblings are not any of them. And I think my mom wants to keep it that way, which I can understand. She also remarried, and my stepdad is a great man. He owns his own carpentry business. It's still something I think about on occasion anytime I hear or see stories about drug-related crimes, or even car accidents, and it brings back all of those memories and the what-ifs to my mind. Hey Raven, I am behind, and I recently watched one of your older videos on family secrets, and it reminded me of a story of my own family that I had to share. I had a pretty normal family except for one strange gap in our history that I learned no one ever really wanted to talk about. That is my Aunt Dana. She was rarely mentioned, and when she was, the conversation would be hushed or quickly changed to a different topic. As a kid, I assumed it was just a falling out over something. They never talked about her in past tense, so I didn't think she was dead, but I also never met her. Maybe she followed the wrong crowd and just never talked to the family again. I had no idea. I didn't try to push it, but I just let it be what it was. That, however, didn't mean I wasn't curious. We were at my grandparents' place preparing for Thanksgiving, and something steered me in the direction of a family tree. This made me ask my grandmother about Dana. My grandma leaned into my ear and told me that we shouldn't talk about Dana around my mother, and quickly tried to distract me by asking me to help her. When I was 16, I was helping my mom clean out the basement when I found an old photo album. My mom and I started going through them, and she was smiling, telling me about some of the photos. Until we got to a picture of a young woman with 2 younger children. I immediately recognized my grandma and assumed the 2 girls were my mother and her sister, my Aunt Dana. I played it off, though, asking if that was correct, and her smile faded and she confirmed, and then she took the book from me. I asked her about her sister, and she said that there was nothing to talk about. I hated responses like that. It was as bad as because I said so I pushed her. I asked why everyone was so secretive about Aunt Dana. What happened to her? My mom snapped at me, saying that I had no right and to drop it. I was 16, and I thought that I had to have the last word, so I shouted that everyone else seemed to be the jerks to Dana, and then I stormed off. I could hear my mom sobbing in the basement shortly after. Part of me felt bad, but I also didn't understand the whole ordeal with Dana, and why no one would talk about it. I just thought that if someone would talk to me and tell me, then maybe I would understand and could move on. But until then, I was going to be the ornery and nosy little teenager. I tried to do my own digging to find out more about Aunt Dana, but I couldn't even find an address, a phone number, or really any indication of where she was living. I did find an old album that I was going through previously, and found a few more pictures in there, but they didn't seem as happy. There was one of my mom and Dana hugging, but Dana looked uninterested. Another from my mom's birthday, and Dana was sitting next to her looking unhappy. It was strange, but I just figured it was a sibling thing. Then, there was one day that I went to my grandma's for the day and we started talking. She was talking about when she was in school and how she was a troublemaker. Then she mentioned my mom being the exact opposite in school and how relieved she was. I took the opportunity to try and ask about Dana. Her mood shifted slightly, but after a heavy sigh, she said that Dana did well in school too, but shook her head as she solemnly said, "I just don't know what got into her to change." I asked her what she meant by that, and she told me that after my mom was born, Dana started to change. There was a 6-year difference between them, and Dana had enjoyed school and loved to show off what she did or learned. She was even excited about having a little sister, but once my mom was old enough to start school and was talking on her own, that was when Dana began to change. She didn't bring home school projects anymore. She didn't talk about school. She seemed to be moody a lot, and didn't want to do anything with my mom. There were times that they would even fight, and Dana would call my mom names, push her, or just physically fight with her. I asked her what happened to her, and that's where my grandma shut down again and tried to change the subject. It just seemed to me that they were 2 sisters that fought. Not really a reason to completely disown one of them. But as time all went on, I had already come to the conclusion that I would always be an only child, and I couldn't help but want to know more about this aunt that I never met. I had asked for siblings several times, as kids do, but I would always be told maybe. I knew it wasn't going to happen the older I got, so when I was older and understood how to use the internet better, I started trying to do my own research, starting with one of those family tree websites. I was then able to get my aunt's full name and date of birth, and there was no record of death. So that at least confirmed that she probably was still alive. From there, I went to the library to try to find any public records of her life. I wasn't expecting to dive into this cryptic rabbit hole that was attempted to be covered up at every angle. I found a few news articles related to an old address that my parents used to live at, but there were no names given. It just said that there was an attack at the home. It happened during the time that my grandparents lived there, which both worried me and piqued my interest. So I looked up arrests and court records. I was not expecting what I actually found. There, in a crappy mugshot, was my Aunt Dana looking crazed, yet tired. She was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, as well as some other charges. Who did she try to hurt? It didn't really give me much more information. The records also mentioned restraining orders being broken, so I was curious as to who had one on Dana. I started running into roadblocks there, but still wanted to know more. So I went back to my grandmother. I will add that at this point, I was about 20. I wasn't a little kid anymore, and I could handle the darker conversations, and I think that's what helped my grandmother to finally come to terms that they wouldn't be able to hide it forever. She begged me not to tell my mom that I told her, or she would never forgive me, and I agreed. She also joked that she would rip me from her will, and I totally believed her too. Finally, after many years, she filled in the blanks. My Aunt Dana had done a complete 180 as a kid. She began being very mean to my mom, physically and mentally. My mom and dad started dating when she was 17, my dad 19. As I've heard that from my mom too. They got pretty heavily involved with each other and fell in love hard. Dana hated it. As my grandma put it, she seemed to be jealous. They had actually gotten into a pretty big fight a few times, with Dana trying to convince my dad to leave my mom. However, their relationship was too strong to let Dana come between them. But Dana only got angrier when she learned that my parents were going to get married, refusing to be involved in the wedding, and she even tried to hit on my dad to try and convince him to call it off. And when my mom announced that she was pregnant about 3 months after the wedding, all hell broke loose. Dana, my mom, and grandparents all got into a huge fight, and Dana threatened my mom. My grandparents actually filed a restraining order, preventing her from being able to go to their home, hoping to give my mom a safe place when they came over. It all escalated one night when my parents stayed with my grandparents while they were waiting on getting a new home. They had been staying at my paternal grandparents' guest house, but they had to redo the floor, and my parents were in the process of buying their own home. My mom had fallen asleep in the living room, having troubles getting comfortable now that she was about 8 months pregnant. My Aunt Dana, who still actually had a key to my grandparents' house, showed up, and slowly walked into the house. That's when she noticed my mom asleep on the couch. Dana went to the kitchen, grabbed a steak knife, and began stabbing my mother. She stabbed her in the thigh, only nicked her belly, thankfully, and stabbed her in the arm as my mother woke up and began fighting her. My dad was in there too as soon as he heard her screaming, and got Dana off my mom and had pinned her to the ground. She was arrested that night, and the only thing she had to say to anyone was that she was mad that she missed her stomach, saying that she didn't deserve to have a baby. They pressed charges, and my mom actually went into labor that night due to the stress. I was born premature, which that I at least knew. I remember seeing a scar on my mom's arm and hand, but she told me that it was from an accident, and I never questioned it. She got those scars trying to defend both of us. And that is when I felt like a crappy kid. I never really thought that maybe they didn't talk about Dana because it was too traumatic or painful for those involved. But my grandma explained what happened. They then went with the insanity plea, and she was actually locked up in a psychiatric ward. My grandma said that she tried to visit her, but she showed no interest in wanting to see her and continued being aggressive, so she stopped going. I hugged her and thanked her for telling me, while also crying and apologizing that they all went through it. I saw my mom that day, and I hugged her and told her just how much I appreciated all that she had done for me. I kept my word to my grandma, and I never told my mom that I knew the real story. I can only assume that affected their opinion on having a second child, too, wanting to make sure history didn't repeat itself. So, I'll just carry this secret with me, too, along with the newfound respect for both my parents and all they have done to protect me. To start this write-up about the Freeman family murders, it's important to define familicide. A familicide is a type of murder, or murder-suicide, in which an individual kills multiple close family members in quick succession. Most often children, spouses, siblings, or parents. In half of the cases, the killer lastly ends their own lives in a murder-suicide. In this rich tapestry known as humanity, there are a percentage of people who become killers. Of these killers, there are various different types, as most people listening to this will know. But today we're going to look at a specific type of killer, possibly the most terrifying of them all, the family annihilator. Now, having already defined familicide, it's important to understand that even among the family annihilators, there have been classified 4 distinct types. 1. The self-righteous. These killers blame the mother for any of the family's problems, and they often believe that their status as breadwinner is central to their ideal image of the family. They might even call their partner before the murders to explain their actions. 2. The disappointed. The disappointed family annihilator feels that their family has failed them or somehow undermined their ideal image of family life. This could come from children not following established family traditions or observing traditional religious practices. 3. Anomic. With these killers, the family is seen as the result of financial success, and when that success falters, the family is no longer seen as having a purpose. And 4. Paranoid. These killers sense some kind of external threat to the family. This can range from perceived societal decline to pending issues with the legal system. Whatever the threat, or perceived threat is, the killer sees ending the family's lives as the only way to protect them. The psychologies of these 4 types are disconcerting because, for all the vast differences between them, there are so many disturbing similarities. From triggers and responses, all the way to being capable of tremendous violence. Now, I'm compelled to say the overwhelming majority of family annihilator cases are when the patriarch of the family unleashes hell upon the people he was meant to cherish and protect. This is not always the case, however, and even as I have laid out some norms, I am going to present you a case that falls outside of these established parameters. Dennis and Brenda Freeman were a very religious couple, and had raised their 3 sons, Brian, David, and Eric, as devout Jehovah's Witnesses. For Brian and David, however, this religious lifestyle would only breed hatred and resentment in them, of the most radical kind. The teenage Brian and David fell in with a group of white supremacists and began to live a very neo-Nazi lifestyle. Friends of the late Brenda Freeman have said that Brenda was terrified of her 2 eldest sons. The boys went all in on the lifestyle too, Brian having the word berserker tattooed across his forehead, while David had the always classy Sieg Heil tattooed over his eyebrows. Dennis and Brenda did all they could to try to reconnect with their sons and to pull them back from this very dark path they were heading down. Brenda contacted therapists asking for advice. The boys even attended anti-skinhead education, courses organized by the police, but despite their best efforts, the boys would not turn away from their creed of hate. The brothers were both deeply troubled, with Brian being admitted to a psychiatric unit for severe mental health issues, and David having done stints at multiple juvenile detention centers and receiving counseling for substance abuse. From 1993 to 1995, The police made a total of 5 visits to the Freeman home. During one of these instances, the police said that Brian had threatened to kill his parents over a fight about using the family car. Both youths were on a very dangerous spiral. They both had their issues, but fueled by rhetoric of hate, and people preying upon their anger only exacerbated their issues. A pattern of substance abuse and poor mental health coupled with their neo-Nazi beliefs was a recipe for absolute disaster, as the world was about to learn firsthand. February 26th of 1995 would see violence that would shatter multiple lives, and see the tragic and senseless end of 3. Brian, 17, and David, 16, had been out at the movies with their elder cousin, Nelson Ben Birdwell, 18. They had returned home to the Freeman family home afterwards, where Brian and Brenda got into a heated altercation about Birdwell being in the house. Things between Brian and his mother escalated, resulting in Brenda being stabbed to death by her eldest son. Meanwhile, David and Birdwell had gone upstairs where Dennis Freeman was sleeping at the time. The pair assaulted Dennis and beat him to death with an aluminum baseball bat. But the rampage was not done just yet. The spree's final victim was the 10-year-old Eric Freeman. It's some combination of Brian, David, and Birdwell bludgeoning the boy as he slept with the handle of a pickaxe. Afterwards, in the immediate aftermath, the murderous trio fled from Pennsylvania and went to the home of one of their associates, Frank Hess, who was living in Hope, Michigan at the time. The day after the murders, Brian and David's eldest sister, Valerie, found the bodies of her family. The scene that met the authorities was one of absolute brutality. Dennis and Eric were beaten so badly that their faces were barely recognizable. The Allentown coroners said that it was one of the most brutal acts of murder they had ever seen. The killings took place on February 26th, and the trio were apprehended on March 2nd. With the death penalty very much on the table, Brian Freeman pled guilty to the murder of Brenda Freeman. In a separate plea, David pleaded guilty to the killing of Dennis. Birdwell was charged with all 3 murders. However, no one was ever convicted for the killing of young Eric. Birdwell was, however, found guilty for his part in beating Dennis Freeman to death when blood on his shirt was found to belong to Dennis. Initially, all 3 men were sentenced to life without parole. But in the intervening years, things have changed, and as of 2024, Brian and Dennis were resentenced to 60 years with parole eligibility. However, this was good news in the abstract, as the brothers will still not be eligible for parole until 2055, another 30 years from the time of this writing. Brian, for his part, has expressed remorse for what he did in his youth. He has said that the murders were the result of years of built-up animosity between the brothers and their parents. While I'm not going to try to excuse his behavior, obviously I do think the things that a twisted ideology like Nazism can do to someone that is abusing drugs and suffering a mental health crisis cannot be underestimated. Just like any cults, that culture preys upon people who feel frustrated and not in control of their life. The culture fosters that hatred and teaches you to see everyone as a potential enemy. Ultimately, it teaches you to lash out at your perceived persecutors. It's a very slippery slope, and it's one that I've seen several people fall into and get caught up in. So, this was the case of the Freeman family murders. A family annihilator case that breaks the mold to some extent, but at the same time falls so neatly into the category. As with most things, it's complicated, and requires a lot of different perspective to see the entire picture. A lot of things contributed to the tragedy that unfolded on that day 30 years ago, but the biggest culprit of all was the toxic ideology that taught these youths to embrace their rage and their hate. Ultimately, that ideology turned 3 young men into brutal killers for one terrible night. And until we can figure out how to keep that kind of hate from poisoning young men like Brian and David Freeman, there will be no shortage of tragedies in the future. This might be a little different from the stories you've read before, but this was still something that not only came as a surprise to my family, but also affected me mentally. Growing up, I always knew my grandma was eccentric. Hell, the whole family knew that. She never acted like your normal, frail old lady. She laughed, she drank with the other adults, she danced, and she even tried to ride on my brother's skateboard. She fell on her rear, but had a good laugh about it. I know that I loved her energy, and I told myself that I hope I was the same way when I got older. We had bi-weekly dinners at her place, too. Every other Sunday, which went fine. She loved to share stories with us about being a kid herself, and she also had a lot of keepsakes. It was something that seemed so innocent, but my dad, my grandma's son, clearly seemed uncomfortable about it. She had a small shadow box in her china cabinet with baby teeth in it. Every single grandkid's baby teeth were in there and labeled with our names and the date they fell out. Now, I know a lot of people keep their kids' teeth, or one or two maybe, so it's not abnormal. But she kept every single one. I remember when one of my teeth fell out, I talked about putting it under my pillow for the tooth fairy, and she begged me to just give it to her instead, offering her $20 for it. That was a lot more than I ever expected to get for a tooth, so I just gave them to her. Again, yeah, it was a little weird to my kid's self, but we just joked about my grandma being the real tooth fairy. But other than teeth, she also liked to collect hair. She cut her own hair and would occasionally cut ours if we wanted it, but if she did, she would immediately collect the hair by hand, brushing it off and adding it to a small baggie. I remember one year cutting my hair really short. At the time, it was down to my mid-back, and I cut it to my shoulders. She loved it, but then also asked for the hair. I remember how upset she was when my dad said that he didn't keep it. I didn't get the argument on either side, being upset that you didn't get to keep someone's hair and being so upset about someone else wanting to keep it. So yes, she was a very eccentric person, but she was also one of my favorite people. She came over to our place one time to visit, and I showed her my room because I wanted to show her a collection that I had started. It was of deformed or different flowers, leaves, and rocks. If the flower was multicolored, the leaves were deformed or the veins seemed to make a picture, or a unique rock, I kept them. I took them from the yard, school, parks, anywhere I found them. She seemed to enjoy it and said that I clearly had the family collecting genes, just like her. I remember her caressing one of my rocks and saying, "It's in our blood. Your father just doesn't understand it." I just liked collecting weird stuff. So did she, but mine felt less intrusive. But at the time, I just thought it wasn't that big of a deal. But then, my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. It was unexpected, but she didn't suffer or anything, which at least gave us all that peace of mind. Because it was unexpected, my dad was left to handle her estate. He had 3 living siblings, one he hadn't spoken to for many years, and the other 2 wanted nothing to do with any of her stuff. So he was the only option to settle it all. Grandma's house was bigger than ours, and since it was now my dad's, I didn't understand why my parents just didn't move into it, giving us more room. But we were allowed to be there as he cleaned it out, saying that we could take whatever we wanted as a keepsake. While several of us were scattered around the house, I decided to take the opportunity to peek through the attic. I always wanted to go through there because it seemed to be one of those cozy and hidden spots that intrigued me as a kid, but my grandma never allowed me in. She always said that she kept her treasure in there, which, as a kid, only made me want to go through it all even more. So, I went through it. As I entered, I realized the look of it was underwhelming. It was old and dusty for the most part, except for one corner in the front that seemed to be completely cleaned. There were boxes and tubs stacked methodically, and each one with a name on them. Most names I recognized. My mom and dad, my 2 uncles that passed, my other living aunts and uncle, my cousins, and even one for me and my brother. I first assumed it was either our belongings that she had, or maybe boxes that were meant for us. Maybe instead of a will, she just had things in these boxes for each person. So I grabbed my box to go through it. Clearly it was meant for me, right? I wish I hadn't done that. When I opened my box, there was nothing in there that I wanted. Inside was a bag of hair. There were used bloody tissues with a piece of tape with writing on it. Nosebleed April 2002. There was a small envelope filled with what I think was fingernail clippings. I even saw my old retainer that I thought I had lost, but my name and age was written on it. I was weirded out, but I decided to go through a different box, hoping to find something better. I opened my brother's box and found similar items. But there were some used band-aids with dates written on them. But then there was also a jar filled with a yellowed liquid, and something long and thin. Something organic in the jar. The top of the jar was written, "Umbilical Stump," with my brother's birthday on it. I was pretty creeped out at this point. What the hell was my grandma doing with all this stuff? Used bloody tissues and other organic materials? I knew that she collected teeth and hair, but this was crazy to me. She had boxes labeled for everyone. Just opening them, I could see much of the same things. I ran out of the attic and downstairs to tell my parents what I had found, and I remember the color draining from my dad's face. He told me that he would take care of it and went upstairs, telling me to stay out. For the rest of the day, I could tell that the atmosphere was tense. My dad carried out all those boxes and tubs, threw them in the back of his truck, and when it was full, he left and then came back with an empty truck. I tried asking my mom about it, but she wouldn't really say much other than how my grandma liked to collect mementos about everyone she loved. But that all seemed extreme. Bloody tissues, scabs, an umbilical cord. That seemed creepy to me. But when my mom told me not to bring it up around my dad, I just had to keep it to myself after that. I got to keep a few things from my grandma, one of which was her old vanity. And when they asked me if I wanted it, I agreed to take it, and while I waited for them to clear a path to take it, I opened all the drawers to clean it out. There were some old hairpins and clips that I threw away because I didn't use those. She had an old hairbrush in there that was a pretty floral pattern on it, so I kept it. And there was also a notebook underneath it. I took both and put them into a small box that I had started for the stuff I was keeping before my parents saw. I wanted to go through it to see if anything was in there. If it was a diary, if it had contact information, or maybe even just doodles or something from her that I thought would be cool. Well, that journal contained nothing of what I was expecting. There were pages of what looked like journal entries. Some tame, like talking about her day or if something important happened, like someone coming over, or the anniversary of my grandpa's death. Other pages had small things taped to them, like more hair, or what I can only describe as scabs. Each one had a description by it, just like the boxes from the attic. There was an entire page that was dedicated to me when I had to get stitches in my arm. My grandpa had built a treehouse in the backyard, and there was a nail sticking out in one of the wooden steps that was nailed into the tree. I slipped on my way down, slicing the back of my leg open. My grandma not only kept that nail, but she pulled off the bit of skin that was stuck to it. Then she had a page that she wrote about me. She mentioned how I seemed to get injured a lot, and believed I was doing it in order to collect more pieces of myself. She mentioned how I was a lot like her with wanting to collect mementos of others to remember them pure and unchanged. Once again, I was pretty creeped out. With how deep the nail cut me open, I was terrified I was going to lose my leg. I was still a very young kid at that point, keep in mind. To me, a lot of blood where it shouldn't be was equal to a death sentence. I was too afraid to even go back up to that treehouse after that. In fact, blood in general freaked me out. When I had a nosebleed, I would nearly pass out at the sight, so I certainly wouldn't be keeping something like that. And an umbilical cord? No, that was disturbing. Nothing about that was something I would ever do. I didn't tell my parents about the journal, but I did trash it. I closed it, threw it in my bin, and threw more stuff on top of it, so I didn't have to look at it. Over the next few days, I became more focused on myself and my belongings. Why would my grandma think that I was like her? I collected some weird things like my flowers and rocks, but they weren't things from my family. But then I saw the pencil that I kept that my friend had chewed on because she moved. I remembered the notebook cover I ripped off and kept that my crush had licked. It was an inside joke in class. I remembered the popsicle stick that I kept that my brother had given me because it had a joke on it, after he had eaten the popsicle. They may seem fairly normal to someone from the outside, but after what I found at my grandma's, and her claiming that I was like her, I freaked out. I did not want to end up like her, keeping weird things like that. I got rid of all of it, even her hairbrush. I know this may seem like a non-issue to some people, but the idea of my grandma, this kind and funny woman, someone that I looked up to, collecting these weird and maybe even disturbing things from people both alive and dead, it was all too much for me. It had a lasting effect on me for years, and caused me to have even worse issues with biological happenings. I flushed any tissues with blood on them to make sure no one could keep them. I wrapped up used band-aids to hide what was in there. I even had issues with brushing my hair. I would make sure that it was all together and also discreetly throw it away. It left me with this irrational fear that someone would come along and collect these things from me. Now, of course, as an adult, I have gotten better about it. But I still catch myself staring at my trash bin, wondering if I should do something more about that tissue I just threw away. I know that this was a really weird story, but I really wanted to share my grandma's creepy obsession that had an everlasting impact on me. So that, my friends, was a collection of some strange and scary family stories. Stories about family that are, well, scary. I think that's the best way to look at it. 3 of them being submitted events and stories that people wanted to get on the channel, and one of them being a write-up by good friend Tom. My good friend Tom K. Good friend Tom? My good friend Tom. That's what I'm trying to say. You know what? Our good friend Tom. That's right. Anyway, these were good stories about families, scary stories about families that, yeah, just genuinely terrifying. Family secrets to grandma doing weird things, and then a creepy aunt that attempted to murder their sister. So, yeah, terrifying stuff. Definitely creepy. Thanks, I guess, to my family for not being like any of these. At least I don't think. All that said, friends, hopefully you enjoyed this collection of scary family stories. If you did, please do hit that like button on the video. That helps tremendously. You can also subscribe to the channel if you liked what you heard and want more content like this. And, fun fact, you can also listen to a second video, which does a ton to help the channel. If you listen to multiple videos from a channel, back to back like that, that actually pushes the channel harder. Don't know if you know that, but yeah. Or I have a ton of playlists down below, or on the channel, that you can go listen to from start to finish. I try to keep all my stuff collected in good collections, so yeah. You can also leave me a comment with your thoughts on the channel, of course, as I was about to say, or the video, or the story is your decision. You can also join Patreon memberships, get early access to content like this, do a super thanks, which is just a tip to the channel, which also helps the channel a lot. You can also listen on other platforms, such as Spotify, Pandora, Audible, Apple, all those platforms, I'm there. And you can just continue being the amazing person you are by remembering that you are loved, you are valid, and you are important. All that said, my friends, hope you're having a beautiful weekend so far, and hope the rest of your week goes great, and I'll see you again soon. Till then, much love, and sleep well.